Trump says the U.S. will stop bombing the Houthis, declaring a ceasefire as he met with Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney. Now the Houthis are calling this a blow to Israel after the Iran-backed group targeted Israel's airport. At first, Trump blamed Iran, but so far, no consequences. That begs the question, how does Trump 2.0's approach to Israel differ from his first term, if at all? And where does this leave Iran? We've assembled a powerhouse panel to dig deep into that angle. Fatima Abo Alasrar is a Yemeni-American policy analyst and writer specializing in Yemen's conflict dynamics. Gregory Brew is a senior analyst at the Eurasia Group. Zineb Riboua is a research fellow and program manager at the Hudson Institute's Center for Peace and Security in the Middle East. And Avi Melamed, a former Israeli intelligence official and senior advisor on Arab affairs.
When you're able to just tell the Houthis stop and they immediately just turn the switch off and stop, shows how much power Tehran has in the region.
I think the critical question now is, how far does this ceasefire go?
The Trump administration is really focusing on competing with China. And I think this is why the Trump administration made it a big deal of going to the Gulf.
When you are dealing with a leader, the leader of the biggest power on this planet, and this leader is clearly very unpredictable.
I'm Negar Moshahedi, and this is Eye for Iran. Wonderful. We've got a lot to unpack, so let's jump right into it. Greg, we'll start with you. So President Donald Trump has announced that the U.S. will halt all strikes against the Houthis, allegedly because they signaled that they would stop attacking U.S. vessels. Now, there is no mention of Israel here at all in President Trump's announcement, despite the Houthi attack on Ben Gurion Airport. What kind of message does that send?
Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me on this panel today. First of all, I think we need to put this in the context of Trump being Trump. In the past, he has made surprising announcements of major U.S. foreign policy decisions before letting anybody else know about it. Reportedly, neither CENTCOM nor the Pentagon knew about a ceasefire with the Houthis until Trump himself said so, and then directed Secretary of State Marco Rubio to inform the rest of the government. So this was a decision that the president made without really coordinating, without seemingly coordinating with even elements of his own government. That being said, you're correct. This does suggest at least a certain amount of friction or a certain amount of uncoordination between the United States and Israel, at least when it comes to the policy towards the Houthis. The U.S. decision to come to a ceasefire agreement with the Houthis comes at an awkward time for Netanyahu, given the fact that Israel has just now escalated in the wake of the Houthi strike against Ben Gurion. We saw very large Israeli airstrikes against Sana'a and Hodeidah port over the last several days. And I think the critical question now is, how far does this ceasefire go? As you mentioned, no mention was made of Israel or Gaza in the U.S. statement or in the statement from the Omani foreign minister. This agreement was reportedly brokered by Oman. So now the question is, will the Houthis stand down from attacking shipping? Will they stand down from attacking U.S. warships, as they say they will? And will they stand down in their attacks against Israel? So far, that doesn't appear to be the case. They claim that they will continue their operations against Israel so long as the war in Gaza continues. And should there be a new successful Houthi strike against Israel, it will put this question to the fore. How far will Trump go to support Israel against Houthi attacks now that he has made the decision to back off after 2 months of airstrikes?
Yeah, that's a big question. And it's interesting what you mentioned, Greg, there, because there was a reporter in the Oval Office who asked Trump, well, did the Houthis formally make this announcement? He goes, no. Well, then where did you hear it from? He goes, a very credible source. And then he turned to Marco Rubio and he goes, wouldn't you say it's a very credible source? And he goes, yes, very highly credible. So, Fatima, I wanted you to answer Greg's question there. You're originally from Yemen. Tell us, do you believe that the Houthis are truly going to stop, or are they a messianic group that are just going to, a movement that's just going to use this as an opportunity to regroup? And, as Greg mentioned, with the ceasefire with the U.S. and the Houthis allegedly, are they going to ramp up their attacks against Israel despite that? And in answering your question, it would be really insightful if you could let our audience also know, give us an idea of that transformation of Yemen from this, non-sectarian, very forward country to the fractured society that it has become.
Hi, Negar. Thank you so much for having me on your show. And it's a pleasure to be among this great panel. So you answered part of the question. when you asked about the Houthis and whether they're serious or whether this is just a small lull. And there's so many layers to your questions. I'm gonna try to answer maybe from the last point that you've mentioned. Yemen was just a completely different landscape before they took over. So in 2013, there was hope for a better government, and it was just sort of fresh of the Arab Spring. People wanted more accountability, wanted to fight corruption, wanted a better standard of life. And what the Houthis have essentially done is take them back to the Middle Ages with the kind of governance that they've had. It is medieval beyond comprehension. We're seeing a complete system of, insidious system of arrests, of repression, of, lack of freedoms, of women's rights being stripped away, journalists being put in jail. So the Houthis' entire being is illegitimate in Yemen. They have absolutely no legitimacy, and they're being fought from the people on the ground. They don't, and the only way that the Houthis are actually surviving in Yemen at the moment is because they're being backed by the regime in Tehran. Otherwise, they wouldn't have expanded in the way that they did, and they wouldn't have gone from just a local insurgency, as you've mentioned, to this current big ideological movement that acts in this choreography with the axis of resistance. None of their demands are Yemeni. So, and that's really very fundamental to understand. Now, what they've done since October 7th is play on a big national Arab sentiment of supporting Palestinians and Gaza, and claim to be the defenders of Gaza. And of course, what they focused on attacking the Red Sea, on Israel, and this is kind of a new element in the conflict that was not seen before. It confused their followers, it confused the international community, it confused the region, where some saw their, acts of aggression and escalation as standing up for what's happening in Gaza, which is, they haven't really done anything measurable besides saw some chaos and really give Tehran leverage. I mean, it's all what it is. It's just give Tehran leverage in negotiations, and especially currently on the nuclear negotiations that are happening with the United States. And we have to ask ourselves, why is it that they've decided to stop these attacks just now? Why is it that they decided to come to an agreement now? And to be honest, I think many Houthis were taken by surprise by the capitulation and the ceasefire agreement as well, just as many branches of our U.S. government were taken by surprise. And the reason why is that all of this was baked in Tehran, and it's an amazing strategy by Iran regime's officials to throw in something to show good faith that they're serious, but also it shows power when you're able to stop your proxy, which you've denied supporting for years, but when you're able to just tell the Houthis stop, and they immediately just turn the switch off and stop, shows how much power Tehran has in the region. And I think this just to demonstrate to the U.S. president that, look at us, we can do this. We can turn this region upside down if we want to. So there are a lot of messages that are being, said to Trump at the moment. Passed through the Houthis. And of course, the Houthis said that they're not going to stop their attacks on Israel, and they vowed to retaliate yesterday after the Israeli attacks, and which was, and what Israel has done was not necessarily an escalation, it was a response to the provocation that Houthis have done. So, and when Yemenis took pictures of the damage, they weren't saying, look at what Israel's done. They were saying, look at where we are right now and how it was caused. They're asking people to think about what is the root cause of all of this calamity that's happening in their country. Meanwhile, Houthi loyalists are saying, we're happy to have taken these missiles instead of Gaza. So they're intent on roping Yemen into a new conflict. They survive and thrive through this picture of victimhood. That narrative is really important to them and for their legitimacy and for their entire being.
Well, that's fascinating. So really this pause between the Houthis and the Americans goes back to Iran and the nuclear negotiations and the leverage and the command and control that they have. Avi, I was going to ask you, before the U.S. elections, I spoke to a lot of Israeli officials, and they were quite confident and quite hopeful, actually, of a Trump return and what that meant for Israel. But if you kind of look at the pattern of what's happened lately, it appeared, at least to me, that Netanyahu, the Israeli prime minister, was quite taken aback and surprised when Trump made the announcement that he would be holding direct talks with Iran that day that he made that announcement at the Oval Office. And then you've got the firing of Mike Waltz, allegedly, as national security advisor, because reportedly he was having these back-channel conversations with Bibi. And now we're hearing that the Israelis didn't have any heads up about this ceasefire. What do you make of that? How do you read that? And how would you compare Trump 1.0 with Trump 2.0 when it comes to Israel? And how does that affect Iran?
Well, Negar, first, thank you for having me on this discussion with this distinguished panel. I've listened to my distinguished colleagues. They have a very significant insight, and thank you for that. Here is the key for Iran, for Trump and the Middle East. If there is one few issues in the Middle East where most of the people agree on, whether they are Sunnis or Shiites or Arabs or Persians or Turks, is that Trump is totally unpredictable. Nobody knows what's going to happen with him the next day. This is something that is coming across all the region. Before following his triumph in the elections, I wrote something and I said, look, I think that the Israeli right wing is going to be badly disappointed because there is a lot of expectations that Trump is going to be at least the same Trump that he was in the first term, where he was very clearly standing by Israel. He was very clearly adopting some positions that the Israeli right wing was very much happy with. Reminding you, he moved the U.S. embassy to Jerusalem. He recognized Israel's sovereignty of the Golan Heights. He portrayed his vision as of Israeli-Palestinian agreement under the title of Peace for Prosperity, where actually he made it very clear that the Palestinian state will not be fully state, but will be confined, and so on and so on. So in the Israeli right wing, there has been a lot of expectations that the second term will be a replay, but they kind of tend to forget that already towards the end of his first term, there were already frictions between Trump and Netanyahu, particularly against the background of the recent elections in the United States. Actually, Trump basically was using a very non-diplomatic language to condemn Netanyahu. And so it shouldn't be a surprise for anyone. So when you are dealing with a leader, the leader of the biggest power on this planet, and this leader is clearly very unpredictable. As mentioned here before, even its own close circles was really unaware of the recent shift that he was making towards the Houthis. Obviously, it impacts all the regional players, everyone involved, including, of course, the Iranians, because nobody knows to expect what exactly is going to be the next day. And so this is one aspect. The other aspect in the context of Trump's and the region is that, in a way, even I would say, ironically speaking, this indecisive, vague, I don't know even to call it policy, but basically steps or measurements that the Trump administration is taking in the region, in a way, because of the fact that they are so flexible and vague and non-predictable, it kind of creates dynamic that in a kind of a convoluted way could be sometimes constructively contributing to stability. I think that one interesting example is in the context of Gaza Strip. We all remember, of course, the famous statement of Trump standing and Prime Minister Netanyahu next to him in a press conference in the White House. And Trump basically said, Gaza Strip is going to become the Riviera of the Middle East, and the United States is going to take control over Gaza Strip. Obviously, we all remember that he also said that Jordan and Egypt should take Gaza people into their borders, which of course Jordan and Egypt rushed to strongly push back against. Very quickly afterwards, he dropped actually that statement, as well as the other statement that he made vis-a-vis Gaza. But the interesting thing was that because of his very unique position, sort of speaking, which is very untypical to previous administrations, there has been some sort of like hustle bustle in major Arab capitals following his statements, because they kind of like said, well, Trump is unpredictable. He's now coming and saying these are new, games rule. There is a new game in town. I'm the one making the rules. We are not any longer in the same old rhetoric. We have to do something about it. We have to come forward. We have to play ball with Trump. The outcome was what is known as the Egyptian plan for Gaza Strip, that was formally adopted by the leaders of major Arab states, Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, and others, which, by the way, when they kind of like moved the ball to the court of Trump, he basically pushed it back and say, no, sorry, this is not acceptable. So right now, this whole thing is hang on a thread up there in the air. The bottom line is all the players in the region are unified around one thing. They don't know what Trump's next move is going to be like. The most recent update on that regard is that reportedly there has been reports that says that Trump is planning to, during his upcoming visit to the region, which, by the way, apparently is not going to include Israel, talking about what Greg talked before about the frictions between
That's another good point.
Israel and Trump administration, or between Netanyahu governments and Trump administration. There has been report that Trump is planning to announce that what is known as the Persian Gulf, the Arab Gulf, he's going to call it the Arab Gulf. Formally.
That's been met with a lot of criticism by all Iranians, I should say.
I can assure you that the Iranians will not be happy about it, particularly, as you probably know. But on the other hand, we all remember that he also changed the name of the Gulf of Mexico to the Gulf of America, so he changed the name. so what? So that's Trump. That's, I think, the way it's viewed today in the region. And again, being so unpredictable and being so totally off the diplomatic protocol, in a way, has some interesting potential and mechanism to create some dynamic that maybe could stir the sitting pot or the sitting puddle that is called the standing water that is called the Middle East.
Yeah, no, that's there's been a lot of criticism online. I think I saw a lot of memes where they took the name Trump Tower and then put Persia Tower. So at least Iranians have some good humor there. Zineb, I was going to ask you, when it comes to the Houthis, Trump has repeatedly said that he is going to, put the blame on the Iranians for the Houthi aggression. In fact, I've got a quote here that I'll read out. Every shot fired by the Houthis will be looked upon from this point forward as being a shot fired from the weapons and leadership of Iran, and Iran will be held responsible and suffer the consequences. And those consequences will be dire. However, that was made on March 17th. Since then, he's made, very similar statements to that effect. But, in terms of a direct, response to Iran or dire consequences, I have yet to see it for the Houthi aggression. So what do you make of that, and how does that affect the geopolitics in the region, Zineb, and what does that do for countries like, let's say, Saudi Arabia when it comes to the message of Iranian aggression in the region?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for having me, and it's been great to hear others for their insightful comments. I'd say that, first of all, the Houthi question from Washington's perspective, from the White House perspective, is a Red Sea maritime strategy question, meaning that I think that this is what DoD framed it as. This is what what Secretary Rubio framed it as, and I think this is where we're heading when it comes to engagement or talking about the Houthis. I think talking about them as this type of Iranian proxy that has threatened U.S. shipments, but also global trade, etc. And therefore, I think this explains a lot of what people might perceive as a wishy-washy response, that the Trump administration is not as direct against the Houthis, etc. But in fact, when you see the actions, is that one of the first things, of course, the Trump administration did was to put them again on the foreign terrorist organization list, was to put sanctions on Iranian oil shipments, because it's through them that Iran finances the Houthis, because China buys a lot of Iranian oil, so it actually made them much more vulnerable. And let's not forget that actually Trump is operating in a very, very different Middle East. Israel was able to completely reshape the Middle East, in the sense that Hezbollah, Iranian proxies have all collapsed. Assad collapsed. So I think they see that a lot of these proxies are much more vulnerable, and that applying a little bit of pressure can go a long way. But I think this is how they've been seeing it. Does it make sense, etc.? Well, I think it's better to put it in the context where they are talking about nuclear agreement and a nuclear deal with Iran, and that therefore that Iran will make concessions, etc., and the Houthis maybe will be part of it. So I think it's more of a let's wait and see situation, precisely because a lot of these things are unpredictable, but also because let's not forget the capacity the Islamic Republic has to also blow the deal. I think there were some Islamic Republic officials last week. They were making publicly comments about the deal, to the point where even the Russians had to make comments of, actually this is not what they meant, and let's not talk about this publicly. So I think it's better to take a step back, and because the Trump had always had since I think the Trump 1.0 the thinking that Iran is an actual problem in the region, and by tackling it, it's really through that it gave birth to the Abraham Accords and other agreements. And I think that we're going to see something very similar, even as they're trying to reach some sort of deal. And regarding for Saudi Arabia and others, well, let's not forget that during the Biden administration, precisely because there wasn't a clear American policy on tackling Iran, well, Saudis have normalized with Iran through Beijing, and so it's also part of the bigger strategic, I think, environment where the United States is operating from, because it might hear some opposition from Israel when it comes to the nuclear deal, but it's not hearing one from Saudi Arabia. And I think this is also very important to take into account.
Yeah, that's very important to factor in. And just a concluding question that I'd like to hear from everybody's thoughts on this. Do you find that Israel is increasingly becoming isolated when it comes to confronting Iran and as a Middle East threat? When you have a U.S. president like Donald Trump, who has repeatedly said, I don't want war, I don't want to go to war. He's even said that he would not allow Israel to drag the United States into war. Does that embolden Iran in some ways, or does that dynamic maybe, constrain Iran? What do you guys think? Fatima, we'll start with you, then Avi, then Greg, and Zineb will end with you.
Okay, Nigar, it's an important question, but there are a lot of moving pieces of the puzzle at the moment. What we can rely on, predictably, is that the United States will always be supportive of Israel. That has been the policy for decades. It's not going to change now. There might be some experimentation here and there. There might be some transactional aspects of this relationship. I mean, we're seeing with Witkoff, the entire idea is that, you're putting Americans' interest first, and that's what the Trump administration is currently focused on. It's how to minimize spending, how not to expand in wars, and it has proved to be costly in the Red Sea. And the entire Red Sea intervention has been for the protection of Israel. So in some sense, the Houthis did manage to achieve parts of their objective by having this kind of ceasefire deal with the United States. But ultimately, whether it's now or later, there might be a period of also, this also could be translated as giving Israel the green light to act, as opposed to the United States just acting in the Red Sea, where it increasingly starting to ask itself, and the conversation here in Washington is that why should we be involved in something that's costing the European a lot? It's and we've seen that in the BC small group signal chat, and it's true. Europe is losing billions of dollars as a result of the Houthis embargo there on the Red Sea. We also see Chinese ships and sailing through because they've had that kind of tacit agreement. So what Zineb had said before was right, is that the United States is attempting right now to just look at its role, look at all of its role within these kind of geopolitical powers, and try to less engage in the conflicts rather than maximize its role in conflict. It will respond to the aggression. The entire March 15th response was very much needed due to the Houthis' continuous escalation, verbal, and attacks on Trump's personally as well. So the response was warranted, and it was preempted but warranted. And the lull that's happening right now is definitely by design of Tehran, as I mentioned, because of the nuclear deal. So there are different moving pieces here, and I think it would be just interesting to watch things day by day, because what policy we have today may not be true for tomorrow, and especially in this current situation and administration.
Avi, would you like to go next?
Look, there is a common denominator between Israel, the Saudis, United Arab Emirates, Egyptians, and others. They are all deeply threatened by this mullah regime. They all would like to see this mullah regime evaporating the next day. The Arab states basically won't say it openly. They want to have a good neighborhood with the and they know exactly what the mullah regime is. This is a regime that presents, particularly to the Saudis, an enormous threat. But as part of the game of the region, this is their position. Now, here is the thing about this whole issue of Israel being isolated or not. In the end of the day, it's not about Israel being isolated or not. The big issue here is that what we see today, Trump administration has an unprecedented and maybe not repeating opportunity to really block the path of the mullah regime towards the nuclear capacities, and by that to really reposition the declining image of the United States in the region. The reason for that is because the mullah regime is in a dire situation. The combination of the weakening of the axis of resistance, I wouldn't say necessarily the disintegration, because it's there still, it has been significantly weakened. The enormous challenges inside Iran, economically and socially and environmentally, the inner frictions that we see within the mullah regime itself, all those things together, basically, the mullah regime today is almost in an unprecedented weak position. This is the point where Trump administration can and should move in forcefully to basically make a deal. And that deal, in the context of the Iranian nuclear issue, has another significant component that has to be intertwined. In fact, when you look at the Iranian threat, there are three major segments, just shortly to name. One is the nuclear program, the other one is the ballistic missiles, and the third one is the militias or the proxies. The less negotiable, addressable issue is the missiles and the drones and so on and so on. The mullah regime will not compromise on that. But I think that if Trump administration will draw a very strong line in the sand regarding the nuclear program. And parallel to that, and I think the administration as of now is doing that, and it's a good thing. Parallel to that will continue to restrain Hezbollah in Lebanon, continue to restrain the Iraqi Shiite militias in Iraq. By the way, sending positive signal to the new rule in Syria, which is something interesting for itself and I think has a good potential, positively speaking. If the Trump administration will do that, I think that we have a good opportunity here to basically have something that will be much better than the JCPOA. And by the way, I have no doubt that this is what Trump will hear from the Saudis when he will be there. They will push towards a diplomatic arrangement, but at the same time they will say to Trump, look, this is a great opportunity. We have to push the Iran to the wall as much as possible to exhaust the moment, to maximize the opportunity, and I think that's what should happen. And by the way, in the end of the day, Israel has to comply with that. I know that people are talking about Israeli attack on Iran. I don't think that this is something that is really reasonable, at least not in the sense of like eliminating the Iranian nuclear capacities. I don't think Israel has the ability to do that. And I think that in the end of the day, all the strings lead back to Trump administration. And this is a very pivotal moment. It's a moment of a great opportunity, roughly speaking. The question whether Trump administration will seize the opportunity is an open question.
Greg, and then we'll end with Zineb.
Sure, I'll be relatively brief as Avi and Fatima have made some excellent points. I don't have a ton to add, but I would echo what Avi was saying, which is that the gains that Israel has made in the last year, the degradation of Hezbollah, the collapse of the Assad regime, the weakening of the Islamic Republic of Iran, the general weakening of its strategic position through the weakening of the axis of resistance. I mean, these are significant victories for Israel. And they can be built into a strategic victory, I think, through the efforts of the Trump administration, through the coordination of what the Trump administration is trying to do with the Arab states in the Persian Gulf, as well as with Israel. I mean, I think there is undoubtedly some friction between Netanyahu and Trump personally. I don't think we can dismiss that, but I think the strategic basis of the relationship between the United States and Israel remains very strong. And to Avi's point, if there is a deal that is reached through negotiations, as well as through, I should say, the pressure that the United States and Israel are putting on Iran through the development of a credible military threat against the nuclear program, if negotiations don't succeed. President Trump has been very clear. There will be military escalation against the program if no deal is reached. If a deal is reached that removes the threat of Iran developing a nuclear weapon, this would be a significant strategic victory for Israel, because this threat is real. It is existential for Israel. And if a deal is reached that builds upon the victories of the last year, and if it's solidified into a new regional alignment that connects Israel with the Arab states of the Persian Gulf through an expansion of the Abraham Accords, that's going to be difficult. That's a whole nother conversation. But if there is a new strategic alignment of the region that effectively contains Iran, along with a durable deal that removes a pathway to a nuclear bomb, I think these are significant victories for Israel and will allow its relationship with the United States and very possibly with the rest of the region to improve and to progress. But it does depend, I think, a great deal on what is achieved over the next several months.
I agree with some of the remarks, and I think what I would like really to highlight is that the United States and the Trump administration is really focusing on competing with China. And I think this is why the Trump administration made it a big deal of going to the Gulf, because that's where the Chinese have been extremely active. The Chinese have struggled when it comes to Israel precisely because of their stance after October 7th by aligning themselves with Iran and its proxies and calling for the resistance axis to triumph. And I think that for the competition with China, Israel occupies a special place, not just as a key ally in a very volatile and a very important region, but also is leading when it comes to technology, biotech, food security, and other things that China absolutely needs. So when it comes to U.S.-Israel relationship, I would say that I'm not worried about it. I think that the Trump administration really knows, and I think it signals how much of a grand place Israel occupies. But for the upcoming visit, I think that this will be the main goal, and I think this is I think the framing of the next discussions when it comes to the Middle East should really emphasize this, because I think this is really the key point, and I think this is why, for example, ahead of the visit, they were talking about a mining deal, a critical minerals deal with Saudi Arabia, a memorandum, and these are actually clear deliverables that show that the United States is still committed to being engaged in the Middle East, even though it is talking about pivoting to the Indo-Pacific. So I think this is how I would frame it, and that the nuclear deal. I think I'm not as as clear cut about it, that this is a horrible, this is not going to happen, or this is going to happen. I think it's more of a wait and see thing, just because we saw what happened with Ukraine, and I think that it would be wise to actually wait and see how all things unfold.
Wow, yeah, that's a very interesting angle, especially like you said, the Indo-Pacific and the Chinese angle there. Thank you so much to all of our guests. I really appreciate your incredible insight. I had a lot of fun. That was a great conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you for having us. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
If you like this episode, hit the like button. Also, leave us a comment. We'd love to know what you think. The Eye for Iran podcast series is brought to you by Iran International, the go-to destination for expert Iranian news in both Farsi and English. For more, head to our dedicated English website, iranintl.com/en.